All right, everyone. We are going to start off with the northern colonies. In this unit, we're going to examine colonization. We're going to split it into the northern colonies, the middle colonies, and the southern colonies. The reason for that, as we will learn, is that different people immigrated to these areas for different reasons, brought different values, and that these values and political systems which they created would have lasting effects into their future. So what you see right here is modern-day Connecticut, Rhode Island, Massachusetts, and New Hampshire. You'll see right there the first colony was the Plymouth colony, which of course is a famous colony of the Pilgrims that landed on Plymouth Rock. We probably all know about that one. But we'll learn a little bit more about why these people came over and what kind of political systems, what kind of values they brought with them from Europe. So as we try to reiterate throughout the class, this is the story of real people living in real places, and here's one of them. William Mullins was a passenger on the Mayflower who brought his wife, his son, and his daughter. Um, he knew the trip was hard. He knew that most people died within 10 years of arrival in the new colonies. However, he was fleeing religious persecution in England and was willing to risk the trip. Only his daughter Priscilla survived the first year. The rest of the family died. Another settler of the Plymouth colony was Captain Kimball. After settling in the colony, he went away to sea again and returned 3 years later. Upon seeing his wife for the first time in 3 years, he kissed her in public and received 3 hours in the stocks, where they put your head and your arms locked as punishment for kissing his wife who hadn't seen in 3 years. For punishment. This will show some of the values and some of the ideas that they had shared as a colony. These were very religious people, and their values reflected that. Roger Scott was another person who immigrated to the New World, who experienced the religiosity of the group. He overslept one day and missed church service and was severely whipped for missing church. In these colonies, church was often held. There were two services each day, and each service was a minimum of 2 hours in length. These were very religious people. Most of the people in the northern colonies had come from England to escape religious persecution, but in the New World where they set up, they created a very religious society. So these people were what could be called religious extremists. They had practiced certain views that were seen as extreme by many people in Europe, and that's why they had left. They weren't allowed to practice freely, but when they set up colonies in the Massachusetts area, in Plymouth, they set up very strict guidelines, very strict values based on their interpretation of Christianity. Many of these travelers to the New World practiced what is known as Calvinism, which had been created and interpreted from John Calvin in the European Reformation following the split with the Catholic Church. Calvin practiced everything revolves around a person's relationship with God. Everything they do, everything in life is about that relationship with God. Calvinists also believe that they were predestined to go to heaven or hell, and that there was a way to salvation, and that through their works they had to prove that they were one of the predestined people. So they lived a very religious, very pious life. Many of these practitioners hated the Church of England. These Calvinists, they believed that all the members of the Church of England were going to hell. They were destined to go to hell. The Anglican Church was evil. So they were persecuted in England by these people. So that's why they left the colony. They wanted to practice freely. They believed that the church around them was full of people, sinners, destined to go to hell. So as they hated the Church of England and were being persecuted in England for their strict religious views, they saw the idea of the Americas and the New World as as a land of promise, a land of religious freedom, where they could freely practice their views, their strict views, and try to perfect their religion. So they left England to create these holy communities. In England, they had been given the nickname of Puritans because they believed in the purification of English Christianity. And they lived very devout lives with strict rules. So when that name stayed with them when they came to the northern colonies, they were referred to as Puritans, and you've probably heard that term before. It's an important term to understand what these people believed and how they lived their lives. These people were so devout that they were willing to leave everything behind in England to pursue the idea of religious freedom, to practice their religion in peace, and to have a colony where they could practice their religion freely. So as mentioned before, it was very difficult to survive once you reached the colonies, but the journey itself across the Atlantic was extremely difficult. These were wooden ships powered by sails on rough seas. People often had barely enough food to eat, and they often believed they lived and survived based on the grace of God. So this is a depiction of the Pilgrims landing at Plymouth. This was the first successful colony of the Puritans that came across in 1620. They felt they were particularly blessed to come to the New World. You can see they're getting ready to step off the boat and their ship in the background, the Mayflower in the background. Here's just another depiction of the landing of the Mayflower and the Pilgrims. You can see how devoutly religious they are. They are all praying to God. He's holding a Bible, looking up towards the heavens, thanking them for the land for landing on this new world, for giving them a colony where they can practice their religion. However, there were struggles. They landed in what is now modern-day Massachusetts, so obviously the winters are pretty harsh, and half of the colony died during the first winter. You can see a depiction here of fires, working hard. These people that came all the way to the world with nothing. They left England, as I said, with barely anything. They had to set up colonies, grow their own food, figure that out, so they didn't know how to do all that, and over the winter time, they lost half the colony. The colonies that the Puritans set up in the New World were what's known as covenant communities. These were communities created and bound by law to work, live, and worship together. It's a very tight-knit community where you do everything together and you're all under the belief that God is protecting you and that God has given you this land to work for. People agreed to create towns where they could grow closer to God. The whole point was that there's a religious idea and an idea of community bounding these people together. An important agreement for these covenant communities was the Mayflower Compact, which was signed as the Mayflower for the Pilgrims who set up the colony in Plymouth Bay, as I've mentioned several times. This was created the first covenant community. It was a written agreement, basically just a crude form of government, but it was to submit to the will of the majority under regulations that they had agreed upon. So it created a religious community and government and society. So this quote from John Winthrop sums up a lot of ideas they had about the kind of communities they were trying to create. John Winthrop was the governor of the second successful colony in New England, the Massachusetts Bay Colony. And so what Winthrop says about his colony is, we must be knit together as one. We must delight in each other, make others' conditions our own, rejoice together, mourn together, labor and suffer together. The Lord will be our God and delight in all our ways, so that we shall see much more of his wisdom, power, goodness, and truth. So basically is what he's saying, they have to be a very tight-knit community in the eyes of God and work together towards a common goal. So this is some of the historic remnants of what's left of the Plymouth plantation. Obviously these aren't left over from that time, but this is the style of house they would have built, the style of fencing, the thatch roof they would have built to survive. Here you can see a little bit more of the colony. You can see the houses set up together. You can see there's a well there. What they're doing right there is you can see how close everybody is, how there's roads coming. They're sharing this community together, creating community close to God in the new world that they could all share together. So the most successful colony in New England was the Massachusetts Bay Colony. While the Puritans had established the Plymouth Colony earlier, this colony was a large draw for people leaving England, escaping religious persecution. In what's known as the Great Migration from England, 70,000 people left England to settle in the New World. 20,000 of those people were Puritans who settled in the Massachusetts Bay Colony starting in 1630. The communities that the Puritans set up in New England tended to be tight-knit. Everybody knew each other. Everyone knew what everyone was doing. They also were very interdependent. People relied on each other for help, relied on each other for assistance so that the colony could thrive and the community could flourish. So what you see here and what you saw on the slide before is not pictures from the Plymouth colony. This is actually reenactments or modern day, obviously, but you see a man working here while the women are talking. This is depicting a close-knit community where they're trying to create close ties and create a community that serves God and is pure in the eyes of God. So the basic building block of these tight-knit communities was the family structure. What you see here is the father praying over the family, his wife and children. These were patriarchal households. The father controlled everything. Father ruled the house with an iron fist, but they tend to be very tight-knit, very religiously devout, and they were expected to uphold their family values. So outside of the family, what they would try to show is that they worked hard and that they were thrifty. That is, they earned their living. They didn't waste money. They didn't try to find things or spend their time doing frivolous things. And what this showed was that although they believed they were predestined to either go to heaven or hell, by working hard and being thrifty, they showed that they were one of those people that was destined to go to heaven. So they believed very much in this ethic. So as these communities grew in size, more people came. They tended to need more laws, more rules to govern the community. One such of these rules in the Massachusetts Bay Colony was the Old Deluder Satan Act of 1647. This required that towns had to hire a schoolmaster if they reached a certain level of population, and the schoolmaster was to teach the local children mainly in religious teachings. And this is how Harvard University was founded. And so there was a lot of social position based on religious standing. If you catered, overall, we keep reiterating the fact that it's a religious society, but they created acts to preserve that religious society, teach the children, and kind of the more pious, the more religious you were, you had better standing within that society. As part of a religious society, the church was the tallest building and was always the center of town. People were required to live in the town so that they could attend church service, usually twice a day, as we learned about in the story of Roger Scott at the beginning, who was whipped for sleeping in and not attending church. So it was an important part that people could be able to get to the church, see the church easily, and attend church regularly. So what you're seeing here is just a town map of just a general colonial New England town. You can see the church there and the minister's house kind of in the center of town, so everyone can easily get to it. You can see all the buildings, how close they are together. The streets are really close. The buildings, their houses are built on top of each other. So that's part of the tight-knit community. And then the fields around there where they worked, there's the school, a town hall where they would often meet. But you can see the nature of how closely built it is in together, and how people lived with each other, and kind of how the church was the center of everything. So you might think that the Puritans, having escaped religious persecution in England, would have been accepting of other people's beliefs, other people's ideas of religion, because they had argued with the Church of England. However, they did not extend religious freedom to anyone else. In these communities, they demanded complete conformity and obedience, as we learned about with Roger Scott, who was whipped. If you didn't follow their rules, didn't believe in the same God, didn't practice the same way, you often faced harsh penalty. Mary Dyer was one of the people who quickly found out the harshness of life in the Puritan colonies if you didn't obey by their rules. She was hanged in Boston in the Massachusetts Bay Colony in 1637. She was a Puritan that had turned Quaker. Quakers were a different religious sect. They would actually end up colonizing Pennsylvania. We'll learn a little bit about them later. But under Puritan law, all Quakers were banned from the colony, so they killed her. There were other outcasts and other people who did escape the punishment of death. Two of them were Anne Hutchinson. She was banished from Boston around the same time in 1637 for her religious belief and feminist beliefs. She had the audacity to argue that women should have different rights and not just be subject to the men in the household. She fled to the Rhode Island colony. Roger Williams was actually the man who founded the colony of Rhode Island. He had too had fled from the Puritans, and the reason he had fled was that he had a strong stance on the separation of church and state. Unlike the Puritans who believed everything revolved around God, Williams believed that there should be some separations, and that's what led him to set up his colony in Rhode Island and would have influence later on. So the Rhode Island colony is important to remember. As I said, it was formed by Roger Williams. It challenged the connection between religion and government. In the Puritan viewpoint, everything revolved around the church. As we showed in the villages, everything's about the church, their interpretation of the Bible, and living strictly by it. Williams argued something different. He believed in the idea of the separation of church and state, that you could have a government influence outside the religion, that these two could be different. This idea would obviously gain a lot of steam, and we know of that practice today in modern day United States, but this was the first area to practice that. So just a little bit about the economy there. It was determined by climate and geography. They settled on the coast in New England. Obviously, it's cold, it's rocky. There's many mountains and hills. They had a short growing season, and often they could not farm. That's why half the Plymouth colony died within the first year. So they relied mainly on subsistence farming. At first, when they got there, they would have small farms. These farms grew enough food to live off from pretty much day to day and hopefully store some through the winter. But often, if the winter was long and harsh, they wouldn't have enough food to last. Um, they started to turn more to fishing, to downing lumber. There was a great amount of lumber in the area, and to shipbuilding. So they relied a lot on fishing and shipbuilding. Why this is important to note, it laid the groundwork for manufacturing that would occur in the late 1700s. They had set up these areas of building ships so they could catch fish, and this kind of created the areas where factories could quickly come in and the economy could grow later on. As mentioned, also the growth of towns. These were tight knit communities, so as more and more people came and the population began to grow, the towns and cities grew. Also, the geography, they couldn't travel as far because of the rocky nature of the land. Also, you obviously can't travel into the ocean. So the largest city in the Massachusetts Bay Colony was Boston, and you can see a picture of Boston depicted here. The politics in these Puritan communities could be kind of summed up as having a split personality. As we learned in the case of Mary Dyer, they were authoritarian. They didn't accept the viewpoints of others. They controlled aspects of life. They whipped you for not going to church. You had to follow their rules or you'd be put to death. But also they had democratic institutes within that group. There were the seeds of democracy. So these communities were democratic in a sense. The Mayflower Compact, which we learned about, established the covenant communities, also established the idea of majority rule as a written document. Majority rule means that what the most people want to do, what the most people have influence on, is what is done within the community. So what you see there is more people having influence on the scales to the other side. It also created the idea of civil body politique. That is a group of citizens acting together as the law under a single authority. So that is, the group works together. It's almost like a body that all these different body parts work together. So these towns and communities practiced what could be called Athenian direct democracy. That is going back to the democracy practice in ancient Athens, ancient Greece. That is the idea of one man, one vote. So they would have town meetings, as we saw. They had a little town hall in that map. They would get together and vote, and so the majority of people, what the majority of people wanted, the majority rule would be done. They would also vote in representatives to what was known as the general court. These general courts would be just representatives from the church who would then be responsible for passing larger legislation, passing larger laws. They would also mainly be responsible for selecting the governor. So this is an early form of representative government. So while it was democratic, it was also a very strong centralized government where it was one man, one vote. That man had to be a Puritan, and that's the only people who could participate in the politics. So it was an inclusive type of politics. So with the Democratic majority rule, the majority voted in laws that were often very strict on society and obeyed really religious doctrines. So some of the things you could be arrested for in Puritan New England were having long hair as a man, smoking in public, Courting a woman without the consent of her parents. Remember, the family is the building block of all this. Not attending church. The church is the most important thing. Disobeying your parents. Same thing. The family structure. And then denying scripture. Homosexuality equal death. They would put you to death if you were found um, committing a homosexual act. So what you're looking at here is what's known as a ducking stool. This was a form of punishment in Puritan New England. This is someone who was seen as either breaking a rule or breaking a law. What they would do is take you and dunk you underwater in a river till you felt like you were going to drown, pull you up, you're gasping for breath, while everyone watches you, and as soon as you catch your breath, dunk you again. And part of this was not only to scare you, it's mainly to humiliate you in front of your peers. As we said, these are very close-knit communities, and the idea of humiliating someone, of showing someone what is wrong in this, is a way of trying to create a tighter knit community, kind of creating an idea where everyone has the same beliefs, and if you do not believe as they do, you can be publicly shamed or put to death. So this is kind of the core tenets of what they believed in these New England communities, in these Puritan communities. So that's really what I wanted to reiterate throughout this for you. But thanks for listening, and have a great night.